That evening, Zuleika convinced her husband that the only way to save her honor was to put Joseph in prison. Otherwise, she would not be able to control herself or to safeguard his prestige. The chief minister knew Joseph was absolutely innocent, that he was a young man of honor, a loyal servant, and he loved him for these reasons. It was not an easy decision for him to put an innocent man behind bars. However, he was left with no choice. He reasoned that Joseph's honor would also be safeguarded if he was kept out of Zuleika's sight. That night, with a heavy heart, the chief minister sent Joseph to prison. Joseph's time in prison. Prison was Joseph's third test. During this period, Allah blessed him with an extraordinary gift, the ability to interpret dreams. At about the same time, two of the men landed in the prison. One was the cupbearer of the king, the other was the king's cook. The two men sensed that Joseph was not a common criminal, for an aura of piety glowed on his face. Both men had vivid dreams, and they were anxious to have them explained. The king's cook dreamed that he stood in a place with bread on his head. And two birds were eating the bread. The cupbearer dreamed that he was serving the king wine. The two went to Joseph and told him their dreams, asking him to give them their meaning. First, Joseph called them to Allah. Then he said that the cook would be crucified until he died, and that the cupbearer would return to the service of the king. Joseph told the cupbearer to remember him to the king and to say that there was a wronged soul called Joseph in prison. What Joseph predicted did happen. The cook was crucified, and the cupbearer returned to the palace. The cupbearer returned to the palace. After the cupbearer returned to service, Satan made him forget to mention Joseph's name to the king. Therefore, Joseph remained in prison for a few years, but he made patience his own, praying to Allah. Joseph's time in prison. Almighty Allah narrated, and there entered with him two young men in the prison. One of them said, "Verily, I saw myself in a dream pressing wine." The other said, "Verily, I saw myself in a dream carrying bread on my head, and birds were eating thereof." They said, "Inform us of the interpretation of this. Verily, we think you are one of those muhsineen, doers of good." He said, "No food will come to you in wakefulness or in dreams as your provision, but I will inform in wakefulness in interpretation before the food comes. This is of that which my Lord has taught me. Verily, I have abandoned the religion of a people that believe not in Allah and are disbelievers in the hereafter, and I have followed the religion of my fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and never could we attribute any partners whatsoever to Allah. This is from the grace of Allah to us and to mankind. But most men think not. They neither believe in Allah nor worship you. O two companions of the prison, there are many different lords, gods better or Allah, the one, the irresistible. You do not worship besides him, but only names which you have named forged. You and your fathers, for which Allah has sent down no authority. The command or the judgment is for none but Allah. He has commanded his monotheism, that is, the true straight religion. But most men know not, or two companions of the prison. As for one of you, he, as a servant, will pour out wine for his lord, king, or master to drink. And as for the other, he will be crucified, and birds will eat from his head. Thus is the case judged concerning which you both did inquire. And he said to the one whom he knew to be saved, mention me to your Lord, your king, so to get me out of the prison. But Satan made him forget to mention it to his Lord, or Satan made Joseph to forget the remembrance of his Lord, Allah, as to ask for his help instead of others. So Joseph stayed in prison a few more years. The king's dream. The scene in the prison closes. A new scene opens in the bedchamber of the king. The king is asleep. He sees himself on the banks of the Nile River. The water is receding before him, becoming mud. The fish began to skip and jump in the mud. 7 fat cows come out of the river, followed by 7 lean cows. Then 7 lean ones devour the 7 fat ones. The king is terrified. The 7 ears of grain grows. The 7 ears of green grain grow on the river banks. The 7 years of green grain grow on the river banks and disappear in the mud. On the same spot grow 7 dry years of grain. The king awoke, frightened, shocked, and depressed, not knowing what all this meant. He sent for the sorcerers, priests, and ministers, and told them his dream. The sorcerers said, "This is a mixed-up dream. How can any of that be?" "It is a nightmare," the priest said. "Perhaps His Majesty had a heavy supper." The chief minister said, "Could it be that His Majesty was exposed and did not draw the blanket up at night?" The king's jester just said jokingly, "His Majesty is beginning to grow old, and so his dreams are confused." They reached an unanimous conclusion that it was only a nightmare. The news reached the cupbearer. He recollected the dream he had in prison and compared it to the king's dream, and therefore Joseph came to mind. He ran to the king to tell him about Joseph, who was the only one capable to interpreting the dream. The cupbearer said, "He had asked me to remember him to you. But I forgot." The king sent the cupbearer to ask Joseph about the dream. Joseph's interpretation of the dream. Joseph interpreted it to him. "There will be 7 years of abundance if the land is properly cultivated. There will be an excess of good harvest, more than the people will need. This should be stored thereafter. 7 years of famine will follow, during which time the excess grain could be used. He also advised that during the famine they could save some grain to be used for seed for the next harvest. Joseph then added, "After 7 years of drought, there will be a year during which water will be plentiful. If the water is properly used, grapevines and olive trees will grow in abundance, providing plenty of grapes and olive oil." The cupbearer hurried back with the good news. The king was fascinated by Joseph's interpretation.